we are going to spend a little bit of time thinking about data literacy. So that may be a phrase that we've heard before, but we're going to dig into it here and talk about it and how we can move forward from where we are today. And then we'll introduce our lovely national panelists here and ask them to reflect on some of the trends that they've been seeing within their institutional networks. And so we have some really fantastic partners from the Coalition of Urban and Metropolitan Universities, the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, the Carnegie Classification Team from the American Council on Education, and our friends from the EPIC network. And Marshall, you'll have to forgive me, the acronym, I don't have it in front of me, but focused mostly on government partnerships with institutions. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the panel, so hopefully 15 to 20 minutes. So if there's a question that you come up with, my colleagues Katie and Lauren will be monitoring the chat, and we can bring those back up at the end. So feel free to share those as they cross your mind. Or if you want to share those until the end of the conversation, you're welcome to raise them yourself, come off camera or come on camera, come off mute, and really let us know what's going on. Okay. So here at Collaboratory, we've been digging into this concept of data literacy. And it is likely a term that is familiar for most, but I'd argue that we gloss over it without truly unpacking or operationalizing it at all levels of our institution. And by that, I mean at the programmatic level. So maybe it's through a program we're offering or a course, up through the department or unit level, up through the division, and then up to the institutional kind of systematic level of tracking and understanding. And so much of my personal work in the last few years has been in data governance and data stewardship. And that's both from an ed tech perspective and a higher ed perspective. And one of the not your usual suspects that I found truly helpful in thinking about data literacy is the Open Data Institute. So I would raise them to you as a new resource that you likely haven't heard of before. They offer a lot of really great resources around data literacy, data skills, data competencies, data ethics, and in ways that are really easy to digest for folks who are not of that field. So they have a definition of data literacy that really resonates for me, and it is the ability to think critically about data in different contexts and examine the impact of different approaches when collecting, using, and sharing data and information. And so what do we mean by that? Well, I lean on this model from the Learn to Analyze. It's an academia industry knowledge partnership out of the European Union, actually. This was work from, I want to say, about 2009. And they talk about data literacy as a cycle. And I really resonate with this model. It is an iterative process. It is something that we don't complete ever. We continue to iterate on this process and really build in terms of the groups that we're involving or the data we're looking at. And so we're going to walk through these stages briefly, and then we'll get to the panel. So first, and probably the most recognizable stage to those of you here in the room, is data collection. And then the steps continue on clockwise, as you'll see, through data management, data analysis, data comprehension and interpretation, which leads to data application. And all of this is through a lens of data ethics. If we were to summarize the 6 steps here into 2 phases, I would argue that steps 1, 2, and 3 are about the logistics or mechanics of the data. And then steps 4, 5, and 6 are more about application, interpretation, and use of this data, or of data in general, whatever data you may be talking about. For us, it's community engagement data is our lens. And so each of these halves of this circle or this cycle require very distinct skill sets. Steps 1, 2, and 3 require a much more technical, analytical, methodological approach. And at a minimum, that requires infrastructure for data collection. Ideally, there is someone on the team who is thinking about data management and how we organize and clean all of the data that we're working with. Even if you're implementing what you may consider a fairly simple survey, there's still a large amount of data management that goes into the process of collecting that data, managing that data, and trying to make sense of the information that comes out of it. You can imagine that this cycle gets increasingly complex as we grow the unit of analysis. So if we're looking at institutional data collection and use, trying to create a university-wide data system for community engagement that is easy to organize, to clean, to curate, to do data analysis on, whether that's qualitative or quantitative, whether you have data on 10 data points or 10,000 data points. It needs to be a very intentional process. And so then if you continue on to the second half of this cycle, those steps require a completely different skill set than the first 3. When we talk about comprehension, interpretation, and application, we're looking at skills that are more around data storytelling, trying to unpack the key value proposition that comes out of this data. What is the key learning that we need to take and implement when it comes to enacting change on our campus or in our program, whatever unit you are looking at. And I think it's one that for the folks who are in the room here today, this is making a broad generalization. If you're a community engagement practitioner, I would guess that even though the last 3 steps may feel somewhat foreign to you, they feel more comfortable than the first 3. I think when it comes to all of the stages of a data literacy cycle, we are looking for a unicorn of sorts. The Open Data Institute actually calls these, or not ODI, the GovLab is another great resource, and they call these bilinguals. So they are individuals who speak subject matter expertise, but they also speak data, and they can help combine the two together to really tell a story that is evidence-based, based on data that has been collected in a methodologically sound way for the purposes that were intended as designed. And so if we see a data literacy cycle like this, I'm not going to do it, but if I were to put a poll up right now to ask how many of you are actually enacting all stages of this data literacy cycle, I imagine a good proportion of folks in here would say, yeah, we're trying to be true and authentic to all 6 stages of this, to be attentive to not just data collection and management, but data use, dissemination. And yet I would argue that does not seem to be the case. And so I would argue that those of us tasked with any sort of community engagement data collection effort are stuck in stage 1, which is data collection. And I do say this to be somewhat provocative, because I think we have so much data, and it's not intended to belittle any of the excellent work that a lot of our campuses have done around data collection and use. But I do think that we are so hyper-focused on data collection and on responding to the imperatives or strategic directions that are handed down by leadership to count certain things or to understand certain things, that we get stuck. And when those efforts around data management fall apart, and they never move past that stage, they never move into the value proposition or the data application, sometimes we respond as if those things are out of control, out of our control, when in reality, those are things that just were not planned for. And so I think this is the heart of where our conversation today really lies, which is in what we call the engagement data imperative. And by that, we mean that data access used to be a barrier to decision making. We used to say we can't make evidence-informed decisions because we don't have the information that we need to do so. And I would argue that is no longer the case. Many of our institutions are struggling to take the inundation of data that we have. There's so much data that we can't organize it and make sense of it. And so our panelists, I'm hoping will be able to take some time today and talk about what it would take to move both our individual institutions as well as the field more broadly further through some of these other steps of the engagement data imperative or the data literacy cycle. So how do we move beyond data collection, and how do we move into meaningful insights and ultimately into action? So I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves here in just a moment, but first I get to say a few things about them. We are so excited and honored that all of you have agreed to join us for this discussion today. We have asked you all in particular to share because of the unique perspective that you have that goes beyond a single institution. I think sometimes we get stuck in the contextualized use case that is, my institution or your institution. And so being able to really look beyond that N of one and talk about trends that we're seeing across entire networks can really help energize campuses that may be struggling with this work or aspiring to this work to really try to blow some wind into the sails to get this work moving forward. And so we've worked with all of you on a number of different initiatives, anywhere from research fellowships and research projects to practice-based cohorts of institutions, and hopefully more exciting collaborations to come in the future. But I will ask each of you to just go around and introduce yourselves, your background, and the organization or association that you represent. Valerie, I'll start with you if you don't mind. Oh, Valerie, you're on mute.
The first part of my muted introduction was fascinating. Too bad you missed it. So my name is Valerie Holton. I'm the brand new executive director of the Coalition of Urban and Metropolitan Universities, which we fondly call CUMU. We're a nonprofit membership organization, and our members are institutions of higher education who are committed to fully realizing the transformative power of higher education for their students, families, and their regions. And because we know that place matters, all of our members are joined by their shared location in urban centers. And because of that, they are, in effect, the canaries in the coal mine. So they see the most pressing issues first. And so CUMU works to connect our members to take advantage of shared opportunities and to resolve common challenges. And I'm so glad to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. I will pass it to Marisol.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marisol Morales, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Carnegie Elective Classifications with the American Council on Education. Our work focuses on supporting campuses who are interested in applying for the elective classifications, both the community engagement elective, which has been around for about 17 years, as well as our new leadership for public purpose elective classification that we are doing in partnership with Rice University. And these classifications are for institutions that have made extraordinary commitments to their public purpose, specifically around the identified themes. I'm really happy to be here. As many of you know, this year, the classifications moved over to the American Council on Education. So we're excited about the new platform we have to build this work and support our campuses.
Thank you, Marisol. And Lynn, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here today. I'm Lynn Brabender. I'm the Director of Student Success and Service Provision for the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, also known as ASCU. We're an association of nearly 400 public colleges and universities and systems. And really work with our member institutions to ensure that regional comprehensive universities are able to deliver on the American promise of access, affordability, educational opportunity, and on the commitment to serve as stewards of place in their communities. So we do this by convening presidents, provosts, leaders in academic affairs and student affairs and mid-level leaders, mainly around work of expanding student access, student success, opportunity, promoting world-class teaching and experiential learning that's tied to career advancement, and also supporting applied research and services that advance economic development and quality of life in the communities that we serve around the country. So I'm excited to be part of the conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you. And Marshall?
Thanks, Kristen. And thank you, Lauren and Katie, for having me, and for also using my paternity leave break to slip in my least flattering headshot onto the slides. I appreciate it. I'm the program manager at the Educational Partnerships for Innovation in Communities Network, or EPIC-N, or the EPIC Network, is easier to say. And I'm calling in from Calapooya and Spillett lands in Springfield, Oregon, or also Springfield, Oregon. Our members in the EPIC Network unite the human capital of universities with local governments and communities to improve the quality of life for all involved. A few of you are actually on the call. And we were officially filed as a 501c3 nonprofit association in 2018. And since then, we've been trying to help our members introduce what we call the EPIC model. It helps practitioners amplify existing community engagement strategies in a coordinated way to improve support for local government and communities around university campuses. Most notably, it helps connect existing courses in that meaningful way. On average, each academic year, our member programs have about 2 partner organizations, but can range from 1 to 5. They've 10 to 20 faculty, 10 to 20 courses, 10 to 20 deliverables, and over 50 to 100 students involved. But some get as large as 70 projects in 1 year. So far, our network has reported over 350 community partners and 1,800 projects completed in total. And so data is a really important thing for our network as our programs begin to grow. Each of those practitioners is managing a bigger and bigger data pool, and they come to us with questions of how do we do this? How are we managing this? And I've had conversations with some of you on the call with Kristen and Lauren about that, and we're trying to figure out how to do this along the way. We're growing as a network, and we have practitioners around the world now with over 70 programs, some in Mexico, some in Asia, some in Africa. And recently we made relationships with over 300 people in Mexico, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. And so thank you for having me, and I look forward to the rest of the call.
Awesome. And thank you again to each of you for being a part of this conversation today and for the work that you're doing nationally to advance community engagement in higher education. I will take the slides down, give you all a PowerPoint break, and we can just for the panel work off of the video cameras. So we'll pop it back up again towards the end, but for now we'll launch into some of these panel questions, and feel free to, like I said, if you have questions as we go, stick them in the chat and we'll save them for the Q&A. If something feels like it's burning and incredibly relevant to the conversation in the moment, we'll try to stick it in there as well. So my first question for our panelists goes back to this question of, do we have enough data? So there are people who think that higher education is not data focused enough, and many who see community engagement to be even more of a lagging indicator in that area. We are just not data focused. This leads to a question of, do we not have enough data? Do we not think we have enough data? Do we have the wrong data? Do we understand the data that we do have and what we don't have? So curious to hear what you think is the problem, so to speak, when it comes to data in community engagement.
I'll take that one first. So I agree with you completely. And I think we see this on the cover of the Chronicle. We see it in the New York Times, that higher education is really trying to re-examine and reclaim its status as a public good, given that we develop human capital and inform citizens, enabling social class mobility and fostering innovations. However, these outcomes are really challenging to achieve and to assess. And so when we think about community engagement, we see that many are sort of using that as a sort of part of the conversation about our institutions and our fields' dedication to the public good. So we see that it's incorporated into mission statements and strategic plans. We see applications to things like the Carnegie Elective Community Engagement Classification, but also other types of rankings, other types of classifications, other types of processes. So we're all trying to do it. So I think I'm going to reflect on your question more specifically with kind of two things in mind. So I was on a team that did a study of 2015 elective Carnegie Community Engagement Classification successful applications for newly classified institutions. And then also, I've been working in the field for a while, and sort of we see the things in our members. And so I'll share from that kind of idea. So first of all, I think consistently we see an inconsistency and a lack of clarity about assessment methods. It's just really hard to think about at an institution level, much less at a sort of national data level. And platforms like the Collaboratory help us to have a more cohesive conversation about it and can give us some cues to how we might want to think about it, but it's still a challenge. We see that sort of no single approach works well for all institutions. So that brings us into the conversation of whether or not the data should be centralized or decentralized. But the sheer effort of centralized institutional data may actually be a barrier to some of us engaging in real sort of assessment, critical evaluation of our work. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but it is a real challenge. And sometimes that provides a hurdle that's just hard to get over. Also, some institutions, culturally, a centralized data collection doesn't make sense in the same way. So when I was in Taiwan, we saw that centralized data wasn't really something that people talked about. And we see that too here in some of our institutions in the US, because it's too much. It takes too much infrastructure. It's too expensive. It's too complex. And so we also then see that a lot of this work around community engagement tracking and assessment is located in our community engagement offices. But most of us who were hired into these offices weren't hired because of our extensive institutional research training. And so we see that we are often tasked with work that we don't have a lot of grounding in. And sometimes our offices of community engagement aren't necessarily located sort of adjacent to our institutional research offices or other centers where there might be greater sort of use and coordination of institutional data that then gets fed up into sort of larger decision-making processes. Sometimes our institutions of community engagement are kind of too far away from that and have a difficult time bridging across the functional areas. I would say that as a field, we're not entirely sure how to operationalize community engagement activities and their impact. And we're also not entirely sure the extent to which that we can have a national conversation about it and what it means for a local situation or even a discipline within sort of higher education. And so all of these things, I think, mean that while we do have data, we're not always sure what to do with it. And some of that is because we actually literally don't know what to do with it. Sometimes it's too complex to even think about the meanings behind it. And then to be able to feed that into decision-making processes, then that's a whole different thing that higher education in general is struggling to manage. I'm done.
I would jump in there and build on the piece about the data infrastructure. I think that, from the student success perspective, our institutions are increasingly data driven, and they really want to be, because more so the piece. But what that requires is, building, technology infrastructure, but also data governance infrastructure and, mechanisms of communication of that data, and then putting data literacy tools in front of practitioners who are on the ground, faculty, advisors, and creating those mechanisms to move that information back up to administrators in a continuous improvement cycle. There's a lot of momentum to do that. But so when I think about the question, do we have enough data? In many cases, the data is there, but it's the actual data governance and the structures and the processes that need to be put in place to then effectively use that data and put it in the hands of the right folks that can really use it to track progress towards equity goals. And the other piece that really comes up for us as well is when you're looking at, is the data incomplete? Sometimes the data itself might not be incomplete, but the lack of disaggregation can lead to an incomplete data picture. So we do a lot of work with our institutions to ask them to really look at, are you disaggregating this data by race and ethnicity? And is your leadership willing to then look at what this data might be telling you to then make changes on campus?
I just have to say, I agree with both Lynn and Valerie. And what really concerns me is, where does equity fit in terms of the data, both infrastructure as well as the time for analysis that we need to make, accurate use of the data to make changes in our campus. And so while, we can sort of talk about, sort of the data collection tools have gone a long way, especially in community engagement. I remember, doing this with, Excel spreadsheets and sort of counting and making sure I knew the formulas to, right? And then, now to the different software systems that exist, but that also costs money. And so when we think about, particularly in institutions that are under-resourced, right, what kind of support is there, I think, across the field to look at tools to support all of our campuses and being able to pull the same kind of data, right? So that we can actually assess across campuses, that we can assess across regions of the United States, different types of institutions, to have a more accurate picture of the landscape and then broader areas of support and development that might need to take place. The other piece is that we need the time, right? Like, we need the time to sit down with the data. And often we talk about reflection as a tool for service learning and community engagement. We wouldn't do good practice if we didn't do and bring in reflection, but we don't have that for ourselves when it comes to, taking the time to analyze the data. And so how do we take advantage of mechanisms like the Carnegie Community Engagement elective that asks for that self-study and asks an institution to make the investment in collecting that data, but also analyzing it, or, IEP through APLU or other tools for us to actually just sit and think about what this means in our practice, particularly around the disaggregated data around race and ethnicity. We need to know the impact of this work on different communities, especially as we're sending a diverse set of students into communities that are much like their own.
So if we focus on the first half of the data literacy cycle, which looks at management or data collection, data management, and data analysis, what trends have you seen nationally over the last decade? And at what level of the institution is this work taking place? Is it happening in silos or, pockets of programming or coursework, or is it really happening institutionally in a systematic way? Would love to hear kind of trends or anecdotes from your networks.
I could jump in on this one. Kind of building off what I said previously, the institutions that are doing a great job with data have really started at building those cross-campus student success teams that look at the data together. But then they, these are systems that scaffold out. So you have, IR, IT, academic affairs, student affairs, all at the table in some type of cross-campus team. But then you have mechanisms of then setting goals and expectations, looking at the data at that level, but then using systems and infrastructure to incorporate and communicate to advising managers, advisors, deans, faculty, and create that continuous feedback loop. So I would say that what we're seeing trends nationally, especially, working around advising particularly, we've really seen institutions be able to move the needle because they're able to have this culture of cross-campus communication about student success, particularly as it's driven by data, and then create processes where they're continuing to track, how many students have re-enrolled in the next semester, as soon as enrollment opens, and then a month later and a month later, or really using these, again, more people organizational structures to be able to really dig deeper and identify a policy that might be creating a barrier for students, and revise that policy and be able to see if that's actually making an impact. So that's what I would say as far as those pieces of the cycle, particularly when it comes to management.
That makes me think about the Cal State system and that dashboard they have around student data. And I mean, they can bring it down to the course level and have conversations with faculty about what they're seeing, right? And the ability to do this across the system is really powerful to think about, how do you make gains, especially for underrepresented students. I think, Marshall, I jumped in before you wanted to say something. So.
Mine short. I just wanted to say, I think, thinking about it in the last decade, I think I started this work in this space, I think, roughly 5 years ago, but was researching it before then. I think just overall, what I'm seeing is just universities in general are starting to want the collection and management analysis and community engagement systematically, like much more so than they were 10 years ago. From my perspective, coming in as a relative newcomer, I guess, in the field, I think what I've seen from our member programs is there's more calls regularly to say, oh, your program is doing what in the community? We need to show that. Please collect that data, put it together in some Avid picture. And some of our programs were even started because the university at a centralized, at the administration office said, we need more community engagement. Let's do an EPIC model program. And thus they want data to be collected and managed and analyzed to make it happen. So that's it.
And I think we can all identify that there are a lot of legitimate barriers to good data collection, or bad data collection, any data collection at all. The things we hear from campuses are typically, we don't have enough time, we don't have enough resources, we don't have the expertise or the capacity to do this work, or the data is not important to our leadership. And so how can we help our campuses move past some of these red herrings that tend to shut down conversation around data collection and data use efforts, to really help spark innovation and movement around community engagement and data efforts?
I have a story that I'd like to share. So I'm old enough that I used to work in homeless services prior to what we now have is the Housing First model. And so I remember when United Way first told us that we needed to have a logic model and also talk about our outcomes. And we were appalled. I personally was appalled. Of course, what we did was essential. The longer you kept people in homeless shelters, so be it a 90-day program or a 2-year program, we were certain that that was better because we were keeping people off the street and we were providing what we thought was clearly amazing programming. And then they did some research and they looked at critically what led to housing stability, what led to preventing homelessness and getting people back in housing. And it had nothing to do with the length of shelter stay. In fact, what predicted housing stability was enough income and also affordable housing. Did not have anything to do with our parenting classes or our rules about TV watching, no matter how important we thought it was. So that has shaped how I think about this assessment work that we're all trying to do. We often are doing this work because we deeply believe that it is impactful. But I think we've seen across multiple fields that it may be that there could be things that we do that are more impactful or a better use of resources, or perhaps even more respectful to the human dignity of people with whom we are working. And so I think some of it is that we say that we don't have enough time. And some of that's because we really feel like the work that we are doing is so clearly beneficial and impacting all the people that we hope in the ways that we hope, that it feels like taking time for assessment and evaluation means that we're taking time away from. So I would encourage us in our conversations and in our own thinking to challenge that assumption. And I would propose that it is ensuring that we're doing this in an ethical way, and so that we have to. And so that would be my counter argument to the red herrings that you listed.
I also think that we need to be realistic that on some campuses, these positions either have been eliminated or people have left. And so there are fewer people who are able to actually do the work of the offices, let alone take the time to do the data collection and analysis. And it may not be for lack of want, but it is around lack of resources and people capacity, because we cannot continue to put more on people without putting the resources and investment in that. I feel like institutions have gone the path of investing in a lot of tools, right? How many different systems does one university really need, right? Mm-hmm. And not enough time in the investment of people who are going to actually be the ones who have to take and interpret this and change practice based on it. And so, I don't feel like we can actually have one without the other. And the conversation around human capacity is one that we have to have at the institution, particularly because we are seeing so much turnover in these spaces and the inability to bring people in. There are so many campuses who are going up for reclassification that the team who did it in the previous cycle, no one is there, no one. Right. And so we can have all of the tools we want, but unless there's people who understood like the landscape, who are able to have that time to look at that data and previous applications, they're basically starting from scratch. And so there has to be a way to talk about this that also brings in the human capacity, not just in terms of training, but also giving the kinds of funding and support to these offices to do this work effectively and ethically.
Marisol, I see that so often, what you said about the person being asked to do it wasn't there previously, and it was just a couple of years ago, and they're starting from scratch. And I just want to take my last talking point of like universities want to get more of the management and analysis of community engagement front and center. And I think you all as practitioners who are going to be working on this can use that to advocate for that human capital resource that Marisol was talking about. I've seen from our network that some folks are able to kind of take Valerie's example of like the choice between program provision and assessment and evaluation to their administration, say, I do this much. If you do this, like if you want me to do this, I lose out here. What is the ratio? What lever, or how far do you want me to turn the lever in either direction? And they'll take with them successful examples. Like I'm thinking of Christina. I think I've had a couple conversations with you from Christina from ASU. I think I've had a couple conversations with you that have become examples that we've used with other programs, other universities to say, look, if you do this, you'll free up a bunch of time. You'll create these meaningful outcomes. You'll be able to do all of this other stuff. And having those successful examples identified also really helps get past that red herring or get over those barriers, I think, as well as using the university's commitment to do those things.
So going back to the point around capacity and people, how are we able to leverage more interdisciplinary teams that could support this kind of work? I know many offices of engagement rely on their institutional research office or have asked for explicit data support in their office of engagement, that, it's not the program manager that necessarily has to manage the assessment and the evaluation, or even the program design and logic modeling that might happen. But what are, I guess I'm asking, what are your recommendations for building capacity and resources when resources are limited? Who should institutions consider pulling together or partnering with for assessment and evaluation work?
I'll just circle back to my key theme of the cross-campus team. And I think that what's been, what we've been talking about is really this need to have ownership, not just by IR. That it's a data-driven culture at the leadership level, but that's really then, I would say that IR, again, IT, leadership in academic affairs, leadership in student affairs, leadership in community engagement, anyone, faculty senate members, the institutions where we've really seen this ownership of data take hold in a meaningful way, all have that level of almost democratization of the use of data. And I think that would be at least our recommendation. And one of the things that ASCU does in our work with institutions is we bring together cross-campus teams like that, and we do something that we call equity-minded sense-making using data. And we bring data sets that are not the data of these particular institutions, but we almost do, we use disaggregated data, and we facilitate sense-making conversations with these cross-campus teams, kind of as a way to walk them through a process where they might have to have these difficult conversations, and have them role play whether they might be, supporting one policy and using this data, how they would use that data, and how they would respond to any pushback. And I think that just speaks to the importance of having those cross-campus teams and having them really versed in how to talk about data as well.
I agree with Lynn around the cross-campus teams. I would also add, this could be a great avenue to bring in community members and train them on data collection and analysis, right? We see a lot of health-based research that are looking at participatory models that are, training community members to go out and do the data collection. We could use some of those same tools to think about the way that we're collecting and assessing community engagement data. I think there's opportunities to bring students along in these processes as well. And then think about how we also build interest by sort of taking the show on the road and, being able to share the data points that we're able to collect, what we're learning from them with different units across campus and different community members. But I think what I'm really interested in is that space in between those two halves that you showed, right? Like, who exists there? Who are in those spaces of sort of one foot in both? And how can those folks be kind of the bridges and translators for both sides of that? And how can we think about it in both qualitative as well as quantitative means for understanding our engagement work more deeply? And how do we do it through a space of collaboration and move our institutions towards collaboration, not only internally, but with other institutions, maybe in the location that their campuses are on, and then really across, because I think we also have a problem of competition in higher ed that we're going to have to address, because we're not going to survive the changes that are taking place.
So if we shift to that second semicircle of the data literacy cycle, would love to hear some of the trends that you've seen nationally and how institutions are interpreting and using community engagement data. How are we connecting it to other strategic priorities of the institution and really framing it in a way that those leaders may pay more attention to it and may choose to invest more resources, whether those be dollars or time or training into that work.
I'll start us off with just two initial thoughts, because I know my colleagues will have more to share. I think one of the ways that we see some of our member institutions using the data is that they're attracting students. So many of the students now have already come through service learning in their middle school and high school years and are looking for meaningful ways to learn and to be able to be engaged citizens. And so they're using it as a recruitment strategy. We also see them using it, and there's some data to suggest that we can be using this kind of work as a retention strategy for our students. So that's another piece. And then I lied, I meant 3, not 2. And so then the third thing is that we're attracting faculty. And we're particularly attracting, being able to use this to attract faculty of color and women. So what we have seen is that also our faculty have come through service learning, and many of them are now coming into the academy with this deep commitment to wanting to have impact in their work. And that means through their teaching, through their research, and across their communities. And so we're seeing that this is a way to actively recruit and retain really high qualified faculty.
So I think I'm on the right question here. A little off maybe, but what I've seen our members do following our association's call to kind of adopt the sustainable development goals is they've begun to use those, this framework. It's one of many frameworks you could use to characterize your community engagement work. But many of our programs have begun to characterize their work by the SDGs, and all of a sudden got a lot more attention from their university, and also a lot more attention from the global community. One of our programs, again, Christina No from ASU, I'm going to keep giving you credit. Their work, ASU's really high on the Times Higher Education Impact Ranking scoreboard, and a lot of that's because they just know how to tie to the SDGs, the research and community partnerships on campus, even if they mirror other universities. No, I mean, the work's amazing. You're doing a lot of good work, but some of it's just how is your website designed and aligning data for it to score high on those impact rankings. And so at EPIC, a lot of our members are trying to figure out mainly how do they use data collection with their community partners, not the students. Like there's not really a big pull to get a lot of data on the students because the community partners don't need that. The community needs data on, does this project that was done by students and faculty lead to impacts? If so, what? Like that's what the community is asking for. So many of our programs are a little bit out of this space about student engagement and faculty engagement. We offer those things and support our members in those things, but many of our programs said we don't want to focus on that yet. We want to focus on how do we help community members use frameworks or just the data management in general to analyze what's going on and make better decisions for their communities, and they need help doing it. So can the university provide that help? And we have some examples of administrative offices at the university also providing that help, not just existing courses. And that's where things get really kind of crazy cool with what universities can do in this data conversation is, your university, there's an example out of San Diego, like your university can help map the movement of your local community towards achieving sustainable development goals, because local cities don't have the staff to do that. They're trying to make the development happen. They can't always work on the analytics side. And there's some really amazing work. I'll highlight one other person, Chris Norris and the Indiana University Bloomington team, the Center for Rural Engagement, that's an EPIC member program. They're working together to map like strength of relationships between community partners and the universities using Collaboratory, and it's incredible work. So I think that thinking about those frameworks and how they relate to the communities is a really amazing way to kind of follow up on what Valerie was talking about, that it's a recruitment tool, it's a retention tool, it's what your university wants to get that local student recruitment going. All of those things are examples we've seen from our network, and I think it's helpful when you're thinking about how you can tie this to other things going on campus.
I think that's right. When I was at Campus Compact and we were doing the civic action plans, Loras College did their civic action plan in partnership with the city of Dubuque. And so you see these spaces like where this collaboration is happening, with the local community, whether it be the city or the school system, and how you're able to kind of assess and see impact and change. But also, I think the important part about data is also when you have the time to realize when you need to pivot, that what you are doing is not working, and you can stop it and pivot to try different models, bring in different voices to adjust practice.
So I have one more question for you, and then we have a number of questions that are coming in from the audience. And this is by no means meant to be a commitment from you all, but I am curious to know what you think the role of a national association or funder could be or should be in supporting community engagement data literacy efforts on our campuses, and where there might be leadership support, or assistance in replicating and scaling best practices, or building the, upskilling with the data skills that campuses need to do this work. Knowing that you can't speak officially for, what your associations can and cannot do, but would love to hear you think aspirationally about that.
So one of the things that I tell people when they're learning to teach is that there's like this terrible pause. And if you wait long enough, somebody's going to do it. I happen to have a very short tolerance for that pause. It causes me enormous anxiety. So, but I saw Marisol was going to jump in just as I started talking. Do you want to go first?
Sure, if I remember what I was going to say. Yeah, come back to me because.
All right, I'll come back to you. Okay, so I can tell you what we are doing because I feel excited about that. So I think, and I think this would be echoed by some other people in this room too. So we're trying to do programming that supports this kind of work. And so getting people together and sharing best practices. We also have a journal where people are sort of sharing and highlighting their sort of engagement and assessment work. And that allows people to then exchange information and highlight the work. And I think conferences are a great way to share the work that you're doing and be able to have those conversations. I think one thing that funders can do and are moving to doing is having expectations for the work and the process, but also having realistic expectations. So many of the changes that we're hoping to be able to sort of enact aren't going to be things that can easily be measured after a year, right? We're going to need to have some sort of theories of change models that help us get to tracking and measurement, 3, 5, 10 years out, particularly if what we're really hoping to do is have some impact around the sustainability goals. We're not going to see, say, reduction in poverty after our one really great effort. So I think being able to have that long-term expectation and having funding that's allotted for that and expectations around that. And I'm going to put some links about some stuff that you could do with Kumu if you happen to be a member.
Okay, I remembered.
Okay.
One I think is, sort of being realistic. I think the same kinds of campuses continue to get the money from funders to do this work, and really a focus and intentionality on those campuses, rural campuses, HBCUs, MSIs, Indigenous serving institutions, right, that are not provided the resources either from the state or they have the alumni base to raise the money to build the kind of infrastructure in order to support data. I think in general, colleges and universities need to sort of think about their reputations of harm with the community and ways to acknowledge that, repair that, and move towards systems of both data collection and data ownership that is, again, collective, right? That, they may be the ones collecting the data, but they share that ownership with the community for the use by the community to do the advocacy work needed to bring resources to the community. I also think that, acknowledging sort of multiple sources of knowledge and multiple spaces that data can come from, right, is really important for telling more nuanced stories or having a more nuanced picture. It is not just the quick infographics that our leaders so like because it's easily digestible. It is the stories of impact and change. It's the stories of hurt and reconciliation. It's the stories of transformation that I think tell a more holistic picture of the data and what can be done, but also puts us on a path for truth telling about the spaces that we need to grow and adjust, and the spaces that we can, sort of claim victory around or success for. So I would say those two.
And I would build off of what Valerie mentioned. Similarly, ask you, as I mentioned earlier, we have various programs where we're working with, provosts, higher level leadership to ensure that they are data literate and also are promoting data transparency as well. So we have those types of programs, and that's where we come from as an association. But similarly, I think that the point about funders and how funders can really drive the value of data, and particularly when it comes to continuous improvement, but then can also be there to support those resources that aren't necessarily there. So you can put those requirements of reporting these KPIs and particular metrics, but there's also an opportunity to really also support all of those other wraparound supports that institutions that are under-resourced need to be able to pull that data, have the right people to look at the data and report on those things.
I think from our end, I have two different pathways to answer the question. One is really focused on our members, really focused on the ground, just taking best practice tools and just making them easier to use is something that nonprofit associations can help, or national associations and nonprofit associations and funders can help with. Just spending time. I saw the assessment examples from Campus Compact. We've taken some assessment resources similar to that from other journals that help folks measure, student outcomes, and we've just put it into the survey platform that university is using, and then hand it to them. We could do those little steps that just kind of decrease the barriers to entry. But I think on the broader sense, I want to advocate for nonprofit associations, maybe working more together to just identify what's the global data literacy certification that we all just adopt. What are the names of the column header? What can we get to one instrument for some of this stuff? No is the answer, but on some of these things, do we need to have all these associations working differently, or all these funders working differently, or all these ranking systems working differently, but asking the same question? I think there's so much wasted time at universities just filling out the forms, and hopefully it would all be adopting the Carnegie classification, of course, Marisol. But I think that's something that I've seen kind of globally, all the global partners we work with, they really answer the same questions. In the US, it's all of the book. But in the global spectrum, and some of the developed some of the other countries that we have programs in, their funding sources are pretty similar. They ask really similar questions, and so I think it just was an eye-opening experience for me on that front. The final thing I'll say on that is just using our space and our funding opportunities to kind of give time for people to do the measurement evaluation, but also to get out and do the stories of success and the stories of this happened and it helped our community partner, or it helped our students find out what not to do. The not stories. So much of our results from our membership network are students provide deliverables and supports, and there's no way we can measure it because it just helped the community decide what not to do. And so I think that's an interesting piece of I don't know if it's meaningful to track it, but there should be space for people to track that so that we can kind of see this is leading to people making really crucial decisions, even if it doesn't land a building that's actually built, or land a theory that's actually adopted.
Well, that makes me think about like the time of impact, right? Like, it's not something we're going to get the results from in a year or two, right? This is a 10, 15-year project. When people tell the stories about the teachers that had the most impact on them, they're like, you know, in their 30s talking about their second grade teacher, right? Like, or when you have that aha. So these impact stories also, I think, need to be understood within the context of time. That impact takes time. There are things that you can measure in between, right? But really the story of impact, it takes time.
I'm pulling on some comments and questions from our audience. We have a comment from Kristen Norris, who says that she fears so many of our suggestions for supporting this work are limited to the capacity of larger R1 institutions and possibly furthering the inequities that we say we want to fight against. And that links closely to, I think, a question from John Blumenfield in the audience. He asks, he says, Dr. Morales referenced a lack of time to reflect and analyze data. And what gets in the way of taking this time? So not just for all institutions, but particularly for those that may be more under-resourced than others.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I think it's really capacity, right? Sometimes these offices are office of one, and they're putting together events. They are, you know, maintaining and building the relationships with community partners. They're training faculty. They're, supporting students. And so when all of those seem so immediate, what feels like it could be put on the back burner is actually what they need in order to be able to make the case for the additional support and capacity. And so I think that leaders need to sort of think about that, and that, I feel like oftentimes institutions are always in these austerity sort of measures and mindset without thinking creatively about how you can solve capacity that doesn't necessarily take just money to do, right? And so I think that we need more creative leaders. We need leaders who are on the ground talking to people in these offices, listening to stories directly from folks, and breaking up some of those trappings of hierarchy to understand what's needed to support the folks on the ground. I think that, and sometimes it's the internal sort of issues around legitimacy and positionality. If you're a faculty member or staff and whose voice gets counted more than others, and who's given the time or compensated for the additional time to do this work.
I don't know. This might be more of like a thought, an idea that could be something rather than idea I've seen work. A proposed idea. That's what it's called, a proposal. Sorry, Kristen, I don't know if you've seen something like this happening already and it failed, but a couple of our members have advocated or started discussing, especially the new ones, that it would be really helpful if Epic N could do X, Y, and Z to help us with data analysis or data science, like using the data. I see, Collaboratory kind of filling this gap. Like one way is just help organize the data, but there are other pieces of the puzzle, like helping to choose an assessment type, making decisions about that, helping along the way to do all that, helping to put it together. And so I'm wondering if it's a nonprofit association that could fill that role, or you all as practitioners could advocate to different associations or advocate to different universities in your region or in your system or in other places to share staff across institutions, like efficiencies of scale type stuff within the nonprofit associations. I'm not really sure. Again, proposed idea of like, I think I have some members who have talked about, either the nonprofit association could help, especially at the smaller institutions, do some of the assessment work on behalf of that institution, or some sort of like just shared amongst institutions capacity building to do it. Otherwise, I think all the other answers that people have shared are what we've seen people do or had success with.
There's another question from John who asks if there are tools that might be used in the field to support decision makers who are reflecting on and self-assessing on equitability and inclusiveness of their programs.
I'll just go really quick. I shared a link earlier in answer to John's question in the chat. AGU provided a really interesting look at how we do equity, how you look at equity regarding your partnerships, not so much for like within programs, but like as you're doing programs with partners external from the university. But it was really well done. It was, I think, on the leading edge of things, and there was a couple of protocols they shared that some of the tribes that have partnered with universities developed, indicating like these are the protocols you have to go through to actually partner with us as tribal institutions. And those protocols were really, really helpful in thinking about all of those questions that you alluded to, I think, just as a starting point. And the work that they put together in that is unfortunate, number one, but also just amazing. They are really leading in the field of how do you do this work in a really meaningful way. And I would look to that. And if you're working only with students, just put in student groups instead of community groups as you're reading the document.
There's the USC Race and Ethnicity, or I'm sorry, Race and Equity Center that does like the climate studies and provides other kind of assessments and resources for campuses around equity. So, and be another resource I can put in the chat.
Thank you. And a question from Jennifer Davidson, who says, Marisol, I love your point about competition and would love to hear more about which changes taking place that you see are calling for a more collaborative versus competitive approach.
Yeah, I see some more conversations now happening, particularly around community colleges and universities around community partnerships, right? And so there's a group here in Chicago where I'm based called America's Urban Campus that brings colleges and universities from across the city together to kind of talk about what's going on, opportunities for collaboration, learning about, what are some of the city and state initiatives or county initiatives taking place, and thinking about and talking together about those. I think there's a group out of Philadelphia that does something similar. So I think there's these spaces that where collaboration can take place. But, it is really, I think, up to these institutions to look at what their demographics are looking like, what their enrollments are looking like, and be realistic about sort of the opportunities to collaborate. The other piece I would say is that, this ranking stuff is really bad for us, right? The universal classifications, the Carnegie Universal Basic Classifications, were not meant to be a ranking system. They morphed into that. People used them. The competition or race to, R1 status, I think, ends up redirecting resources to, as institutions are trying to move from R2 to R1, ends up redirecting resources in ways that maybe don't always support the core mission of our institutions. And so, I know our hope with the development of the social and economic mobility classification that will be universal to all campuses is really to tell a more nuanced story of our campuses. And I'm hoping that that also creates opportunities for us to think about how do we collaborate to see really the impact of higher ed in translating and moving folks to out of poverty and into social and economic mobility that has long-term impacts on their community. But I think it starts with our leaders calling on themselves and others to do things differently. Our associations help with that, right? Presidents like to talk to presidents, but how do we take that a step further to really embrace collaboration instead of competition? And we can't all be Harvards, and we shouldn't want to be.
So we are approaching the end of our time. I'm gonna ask you guys to close out with maybe one more question, and then we'll close out here with a few more resources. But what is one piece of advice that you would have for institutions that are hoping to improve their data literacy efforts around community engagement?
I'll have one that's a little off the normal talking point. I worked with a lot of graduate students and student interns and help support the management of graduate and student interns across our programs. And there's a rule of thumb I started to adopt early on, and I basically teach to them, and it's really led to some increased efficiencies that I couldn't really imagine. Basically, I tell them as they're doing their projects, if you repeat the same function with your keystrokes 4 times in a row, and you realize that that's going to take you another hour or so to keep doing that same function, type a question into Google describing what you're doing, and then say faster or more efficient or hotkey or shortcut. And over time, these students that I've worked with, their data capacity, their data literacy, and their speed of which to go through and create a query and clean data just increases in 6 months. It's incredible. So I would say maybe suggest adopting that rule book for yourself and for others in your office. If you find yourself doing the same rote process with your data cleaning or your data management for any reason, Google it. Google a faster way to do it, and see if you have any efficiencies that come out. Again, off the cuff, you are very high level professionals. Don't really need that advice, but I'm going to share it anyway.
I'll echo the Google it thing. So don't reinvent the wheel. There's plenty out there for what you can do and ways that you can be inspired. So I'll echo Marshall's Google it.
And I would say to, bring leadership from community engagement efforts into that student success leadership work more intentionally, so that those who are leading those programs are actually involved in setting broader student success strategic priorities and are seen as integral to hitting those priorities and meeting those priorities.
I think I'd say is don't be scared of it. Most of the data collection analysis we have to do are not necessarily complicated, formulas or, anything like that. And so I think just sometimes the word data or data collection or assessment freaks people out. And most of it is not that. And so I think that, one, getting over that fear, and 2, I think, build it into everybody's job description in the office, right? See what that means when it's part of your work and build it in regularly. It could be, a meeting once a week, but that you're looking at something. And so you build both that muscle memory as well as the comfort in being able to interact with data and think about it as an ongoing part of your own process.
I'll add an unsolicited piece of advice in here and suggest that folks plug into resources like the American Evaluation Association. I think we get siloed in our niche area of community engagement, and there is such a wealth of resources out there that are very accessible, that can help you kind of take an evaluation mindset and approach to the work that you're doing. So things as simple as helping faculty and staff think about what is a logic model? How do I think about what I'm trying to assess before I design my program or my course, which some institutions do that better than others, but I think there's just a consistent ethos that we can adopt that gets infused into everything that we do that I don't see as being present in most institutions or community engaged work right now. So I will say we have about 8 minutes left, and there are a few more resources we wanted to share with folks as we close out. So I will say thank you again to all of you for being a part of this and for sharing your insights. If folks have any other questions, feel free to email me and I will pass those questions along. And if there's time and ability, hopefully we can keep the conversation going a little bit informally over email after this. But one really large takeaway that we wanted to kind of put forward after we've had this call to action is something to act on. And so Collaboratory is going to launch and convene this new networking group for folks who are interested in community engagement, data collection, evaluation, or assessment. And that can be at any level of the institution. It can be, I oversee a small service learning program, I'm thinking about assessment for my division, or I'm moving into really, I think those institutional assessment conversations are where we'd like to focus this network. But as we've talked with folks in our network and in other networks and in working with various partners, there is just this gap and a need for a community of practice space that brings folks together to think about kind of this engagement data imperative that we have. How do we move past community engagement data collection and move into image and identity work and data storytelling work and stakeholder engagement work? And so Lauren's going to stick a link in the chat, but if you're interested in being a part of this, right now we're envisioning it really informally, maybe 4 conversations a year, just to see if there's interest. And then if there is, we can grow it to be bigger and more robust and have some more maybe subgroups or working groups that come out of it, but really just wanting to create this space to continue the conversation. So we're working with a couple of partners and thinking through what that networking group could look like. But if you're interested and you want to stay in the conversation, complete that form and we'll be in touch later this fall for ways to communicate and get started. Additionally, a reminder that applications are due November 15th for the $5,000 research fellowship that Collaboratory is hosting in partnership with Kumu. And so again, that link will be in the chat. And if you know of folks who might be interested in that fellowship funding or in bigger data on engagement, please share that application with them. And then more broadly, so that fellowship is going to leverage data from Collaboratory's open data set. And right now, our national data set has more than 5,000 community university partnership activities represented in it. And so we really encourage anybody to engage with that data set. It can be, for funded research, it can be for coursework, it could be for a dissertation possibly. But anybody who you think might be looking for a data set on community engagement and community university partnerships, please share that as a resource with them. We're really trying to kind of democratize access to that data and begin to ask some bigger questions, some more generalizable questions on community engagement data. All right, well, thank you all so much for being here. We will share a recording of this conversation via email after the fact. So we have everyone's emails from the registrations, and we'll be sure to follow up both with the recording as well as the link to the networking group and things like that. So thank you for being here. Thank you, Lynn, Valerie, Marisol, and Marshall. And we hope you have a wonderful afternoon.